Desire is a double-edged sword, capable of igniting the deepest love or unraveling the strongest bonds. Tonight, we take you on a journey into a family torn apart by unbridled passion, where temptation knows no boundaries, and forbidden emotions spark chaos between brothers, in-laws, and those once bound by trust. It's a tale of betrayal, longing, and the ultimate price of surrendering to desire. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. It's your support that fuels our creativity. Now, sit back and let the story unfold. Life has an uncanny way of throwing surprises at you, sometimes when you least expect them. For me, one such moment arrived on an otherwise uneventful night. It was a night like countless others, or so I thought. But by the time the clock struck midnight, my world had shifted in ways I could never have anticipated. The house was steeped in an unusual quietness. Grace was tucked away in her room, immersed in her world. And I had retreated to my small corner, determined to lose myself in the pages of an unfinished book. The steady ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder in the stillness, marking the slow passage of time. When the chimes of midnight echoed through the room, they brought with them a deepened silence, one that wrapped itself around the house like a heavy blanket. The only sound that broke through was the gentle whisper of the wind, seeping through the tiny cracks in the window, a melody both soothing and eerie. Then, the silence shattered. A knock, sharp, deliberate, pierced the stillness, jolting me out of my reading. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced toward the door, startled by the unexpected sound. For a fleeting moment, disorientation clouded my thoughts. Who could possibly be at the door at this hour? My mind raced through possibilities, but I quickly settled on the most likely one: Grace must have needed something. That thought brought a fleeting sense of calm, enough for me to gather myself and move toward the door. As I turned the knob and pulled the door open, my breath hitched. There, standing in the dim glow of the hallway light, was Kevin, my brother-in-law. His presence was unexpected, but what struck me more was his disheveled state. He swayed slightly, struggling to maintain his balance, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of alcohol enveloped the air around him. The light cast a soft glow on his face, illuminating an expression that was far from normal. His lips were curled into a strange, unsettling smile, one that failed to meet his eyes. Those eyes, glazed and unfocused, bore the heavy burden of intoxication. For a moment, he seemed to be lost in some internal labyrinth of thoughts, disconnected from reality. And then he spoke. "Wife, I miss you so much," he slurred, his voice heavy with the weight of drink and something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. The word struck me like a cold wind on a winter night, leaving me frozen in place. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. Before I could react, Kevin staggered forward, his arms reaching out in an uncoordinated attempt to embrace me. My body stiffened in his grasp, a mixture of shock, confusion, and unease coursing through me. The world seemed to slow, every second stretching into an eternity as I grappled with the surreal nature of the moment. And then, as if punctuating the scene, the realization hit me: this was no ordinary night. This was the beginning of a story that would unravel in ways I never could have predicted. My name is Mary, and this is where my story truly begins, though not in the idyllic, storybook manner one might wish for. I was born and raised in the heart of the countryside, a place where time seemed to move at its own gentle pace. My childhood was steeped in simplicity and love. The mornings were filled with the symphony of birdsong. The golden sun rising over vast green fields that stretched endlessly. My parents, humble farmers, poured their hearts into the land and into raising me. Their love was the bedrock of my early years, shaping me into someone who valued peace, hard work, and the quiet beauty of life. But life has a way of moving forward, often before you feel ready. At 18, I left behind the rolling fields and the safety of home to embark on a new chapter, university life in the city. The transition was nothing short of overwhelming. Gone were the open skies and familiar faces, in their place were towering skyscrapers, bustling crowds, and a rhythm of life that felt alien to me. Yet, amid the chaos of the city, I found a sense of belonging with Grace and Kevin. Grace, my elder sister, and her husband welcomed me into their home with warmth and kindness. Their cozy apartment in the city felt like a sanctuary, a bridge between the simplicity of my past and the complexity of my future. In those early days, I saw Grace and Kevin as the embodiment of love and stability. Their interactions were tender, their affection for each other palpable. It was comforting, reassuring even, to be surrounded by such harmony. I believed their home would be a place of peace, a continuation of the love I had known growing up. But life, as it often does, had other plans. At first, their gestures of affection were subtle, a soft smile, a gentle touch. But over time, those gestures grew bolder. What began as a fleeting glance or a light touch evolved into lingering embraces and whispered words shared in their own world, one I could only observe from the outside. I often found myself the unintentional witness to their moments of intimacy. At first, I dismissed it as the natural comfort of a married couple. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to sense an undercurrent of tension, a shift in the dynamics of our shared space. Little did I know, these small ripples were the prelude to a storm that would upend everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the bonds that hold a family together. Natural affection should have been a reminder of how love could flourish in its most unguarded forms. Yet, the reality was more complicated than I cared to admit. Over the next few days, the memory of that moment lingered like an echo in my mind. I replayed it over and over, dissecting every detail, not out of judgment, but because it stirred something unfamiliar in me. I was caught between admiration and discomfort, between longing and unease. My emotions were tangled, and I wasn't sure how to unravel them. Their relationship, so open and tender, was a stark contrast to the kind of love I had grown up around. My parents were pillars of quiet strength. Their love was steady, dependable, and enduring. But it had never been something I could see. Only something I felt in their actions, an extra helping of food at dinner, a light left on for me when I was out late, a gentle pat on the shoulder when words seemed unnecessary. In their world, love was a current flowing beneath the surface, never breaking into waves for the world to see. Grace and Kevin, however, lived their love out loud. It wasn't just in the way they kissed or held each other, it was in the way they spoke to one another. Their words laced with warmth and familiarity. It was in the way their eyes met across a room, as if sharing a secret only they understood. Their love was bold, unapologetic, and visible, a love that demanded to be seen and celebrated. I began to notice more of these moments as time went on. A stolen kiss in the kitchen while making dinner, a shared laugh over an inside joke, A touch of hands as they passed each other in the hallway. They were small, fleeting gestures, but each carried a weight that seemed to ground their relationship in something I couldn't quite grasp. It was beautiful, but it also amplified my feelings of being an outsider. I started questioning myself. Why did it bother me so much? Was it because I envied their closeness? Or was it because their openness challenged the boundaries I had grown up with? Whatever the reason, it was clear that their world was different from mine, and I struggled to find my place within it. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Grace shared a story about how she and Kevin had met. I had heard bits and pieces before, but that night, she spoke with a vividness that brought their story to life. She described their first date, the way Kevin had nervously spilled coffee on himself while trying to make her laugh, and how she knew from that moment that he was someone special. Kevin, usually the quieter one, chimed in with his own perspective, recounting the moment he realized he wanted to spend his life with her. Their story was endearing, filled with all the hallmarks of a great love story: humor, vulnerability, and an undeniable connection. As I listened, I found myself smiling, genuinely touched by the depth of their bond. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that their love wasn't something to be uncomfortable about, it was something to be celebrated. But even as I tried to embrace this understanding, a part of me still felt out of step. I realized that their relationship was also a mirror, reflecting back the gaps in my own experiences and emotions. It wasn't just about them, it was about me. About what I had never allowed myself to feel or express. Their love highlighted my own fears and insecurities, and that realization was as unsettling as it was enlightening. In the weeks that followed, I made a conscious effort to adjust. I tried to see their affection not as something that excluded me, but as something that had the potential to teach me. I started asking Grace for advice about relationships, about life, about finding my own path in a city that still felt unfamiliar. She was more than willing to share, her words always laced with the kind of wisdom that only comes from truly living. Kevin, too, surprised me with his quiet encouragement. Though he was less talkative, his actions spoke volumes. Whether it was offering to help me with a particularly difficult assignment or simply including me in their conversations, he made me feel like I wasn't just an observer in their world, I was a part of it. Gradually, the awkwardness began to fade. I stopped feeling like an intruder and started to see myself as someone who belonged. Their love, once intimidating, became a source of inspiration, a reminder that vulnerability and openness could coexist with strength and resilience. Looking back now, I realize how much that time with Grace and Kevin changed me. It wasn't just about learning to navigate their world, it was about learning to navigate my own. Their love, so unabashedly real, became a catalyst for growth, a reminder that sometimes the things that make us uncomfortable are the very things that help us grow. And as I stand here today, reflecting on those moments, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for Grace and Kevin, for their love, and for the ways they unknowingly helped me find my own. The love they shared was a bond so evident. It filled the room like sunlight streaming through a window. It was the kind of love that made them happy together. A love so natural and profound that, over time, I hoped I would grow accustomed to it. Deep down, I knew I had to accept that such affection was a part of life, a beautiful, vital part. Grace and Kevin had always treated me like family, surrounding me with kindness and warmth. And for that, I was endlessly grateful. As I sat on the couch, lost in my thoughts, I wrestled with the unfamiliar emotions stirring inside me. Perhaps it was the challenge of adjusting, not just to the rhythm of city life but to being part of a family that openly expressed their love. Their connection. In ways I wasn't used to. Their affection was a gentle reminder of something precious. Yet it nudged at a corner of my heart I hadn't explored before. Though I told myself that the love between Grace and Kevin was entirely natural. Even beautiful. I couldn't shake the strange feeling that emerged whenever I saw them share a quiet moment of closeness. This feeling, indescribable yet persistent, was like an echo in the stillness of my mind. Perhaps it was the faint sadness of a girl still finding her place in a new chapter of life. After all, stepping away from the familiarity of my childhood home and into the uncharted waters of independence was bound to leave its mark. Watching Kevin's small, thoughtful gestures toward Grace, his soft, knowing glances and his instinctive care, awakened a longing in me. It was a longing not for what they had, but for the hope that one day, I too might find someone who would make me feel as cherished, as safe, as Grace seemed to feel in Kevin's presence. These thoughts stayed with me, like whispers I couldn't quiet, as I walked through the bustling streets or sat alone in my room. They would surface unbidden. Would I ever find that kind of love? Would there ever be someone who would look at me with such tenderness? Someone who would share life's simple joys as Kevin and Grace did? I would let my imagination wander, holding hands with someone, exchanging small smiles, sharing quiet moments, but reality would quickly reel me back in. They were just fleeting dreams. Beautiful but far away. Despite the occasional pangs of yearning, I had grown to cherish the peace and comfort I found in the little family I shared with Grace and Kevin. It wasn't my family by blood, but it was enough to make me feel at home. Life in our cozy corner of the world felt like an intimate bubble, warm, steady, and safe. Yet, life has a way of reminding you that even the most tranquil moments are never truly static. Change, it seems, is always waiting just around the corner. The day everything began to shift started like any other. I woke up to the familiar rhythm of our household, Grace humming softly in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. After eating together, I headed off to school while Grace and Kevin left for their jobs, each immersed in their busy routines. Nothing about the day seemed out of the ordinary, it was just another Tuesday. Ordinary in every way. At school, my day unfolded as expected. I attended my lectures, chatted with friends, and focused on my studies. Yet, through it all, I found myself looking forward to the evening, the time when I would return to the warmth of home and share dinner with Grace and Kevin. Those dinners, though simple, were moments that brought us closer. Small anchors of togetherness in the flow of daily life. When I arrived home that evening, the soft glow of the kitchen light greeted me. Grace was already there, her hands busy chopping vegetables. I washed up quickly and joined her, rolling up my sleeves to help with the cooking. We worked side by side, our conversation flowing effortlessly as it always did. Grace had a way of making the simplest tasks feel special, her warmth and humor turning everyday moments into memories. As the meal neared completion, Grace glanced at her watch, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. "Kevin's late," she said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "He must be tied up with work again." Just then, the phone rang, breaking the stillness. Grace answered it quickly. It was Kevin. His voice, though steady, carried the exhaustion of a long day. He explained that an urgent meeting had come up and he wouldn't be home for dinner. Grace listened patiently. Her tone soft but practical as she reassured him. "You focus on work," she said gently. "Sophia and I will have dinner without you. Don't forget to eat something later." "Okay." After hanging up, Grace sighed quietly, a fleeting shadow crossing her face. She turned to me with a small, understanding smile. "Well, let's eat," she said, her voice as steady as ever. We sat down to dinner, the clinking of utensils filling the quiet space. Grace tried to keep the conversation light, asking me about school and how I was adjusting. I answered cheerfully, doing my best to match her effort. But even as we talked, I noticed a certain stillness in her demeanor, a quiet reflection that suggested she missed Kevin's presence more than she let on. After dinner, we cleaned up together, our movements synchronized from habit. The day's weariness was beginning to show on Grace's face as she settled onto the sofa, the soft hum of the television filling the room. She leaned back with a sigh, her eyes momentarily distant. I watched her, my heart stirred by a mixture of admiration and quiet understanding. Grace had a strength I aspired to, a quiet resilience that held our little family together. Yet even she wasn't immune to the small, aching gaps that life sometimes left behind. I brought her a glass of warm water, setting it down gently on the table beside her. For a moment, I hesitated before sitting down next to her, observing her quiet presence. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, her gaze lingering on the flickering television screen. There was a fragile air about her tonight, a kind of tiredness that felt deeper than usual. After some time, she yawned softly, a delicate sound that broke the stillness. She turned to me, her voice tinged with weariness. "I'm going to bed first," she said, her tone carrying a note of finality. "Sitting for too long always makes me sleepy." I nodded, offering a small smile of understanding. I watched as she stood, her movements unhurried, and made her way toward her room. The soft click of the door shutting behind her seemed to amplify the quiet that now filled the house. Suddenly, the space around me felt larger, emptier. I stayed on the sofa, my eyes flickering between the dim light of the TV and the shadows stretching across the walls. But my attention had already begun to drift, a restlessness settling over me. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was time to finish some homework I had been putting off. I stood, stretching slightly before heading to my room. The door creaked softly as I closed it behind me, and my footsteps felt oddly loud against the silence of the house. At my desk, my textbooks and notebooks were still neatly arranged, just as I had left them earlier in the day. They waited for me like silent sentinels, urging me to return to my studies. I sighed heavily as I sat down, flipping open the first page of notes. I tried to focus, but the words seemed to blur together under the dim glow of my desk lamp. Something felt off, a strange, lingering unease that refused to let me concentrate. It was subtle at first, like a whisper of discomfort in the back of my mind. But it grew louder with each passing moment. Faint sounds drifted in from the hallway, small, insignificant noises that would normally go unnoticed. Tonight, however, they seemed sharper, more distinct. I paused, my pen hovering above the paper, and tilted my head slightly, listening. The silence of the evening felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. For a while, I sat perfectly still, my senses heightened. The quiet around me seemed alive, pulsating with an invisible tension. The distant rustle of wind against the windowpane added to the oppressive atmosphere, making the house feel both vast and claustrophobic. Grace was in her room, the door firmly shut, and I was alone, grappling with an inexplicable unease. As the clock struck midnight, the weight of the night deepened. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against my chest. Then, suddenly, a knock shattered the silence, a sharp, deliberate sound that reverberated through the stillness like a warning. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. For a moment, I didn't move, half convinced I had imagined it. But the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. My immediate thought was Grace. Perhaps she needed something. Forcing myself to push aside the strange unease, I got up and moved toward the door. When I opened it, I was not met with Grace's familiar face. Instead, it was Kevin, my brother-in-law, standing unsteadily in the hallway. His disheveled appearance was the first thing I noticed, the wrinkled shirt, the unkempt hair, the vacant look in his eyes. Then the smell hit me, a pungent wave of alcohol that made me instinctively step back. "Kevin," I said, my voice cautious, unsure. He didn't respond right away. His glassy eyes locked onto me, but there was no recognition in them. For a moment, he simply stared, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice slurred and heavy with drink, he murmured, "Wife, I miss you so much." The word struck me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my chest, confusion and disbelief washing over me in equal measure. "Kevin," I said, louder this time, trying to break through the fog of his intoxication. "It's me, Mary. What's going on?" But he didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he stumbled forward, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Before I could react, his arms wrapped around me in an embrace that was both tight and unwelcome. "Don't avoid me," he mumbled, his voice low and rough. "I love you." Fear coiled in my chest like a living thing. I tried to push him away. My hands braced against his shoulders, but his grip was surprisingly strong. His face was close, too close, and the glassy emptiness in his eyes terrified me. "Kevin, stop. I'm not her," I pleaded, my voice trembling with panic. But he didn't let go. His words, soaked in alcohol and laced with raw emotion, tumbled out in a torrent. "Wife, I miss you," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I want you so much that it hurts." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I struggled against him, my mind racing. This wasn't Kevin, not the Kevin I knew. He was lost, consumed by something I couldn't understand, and I didn't know how to reach him. His hold on me finally loosened as his balance faltered. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. For a moment, we stood there, the charged silence between us broken only by his ragged breathing. The man in front of me was a stranger, his pain and confusion palpable. Yet his actions left me shaken to my core. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers. But instead, I took another step back, my voice barely a whisper. "Kevin, you need to leave," I said, my words trembling but firm. "This isn't right. You're not yourself." He blinked, as though my words had finally pierced the haze. For a brief second, I thought I saw clarity in his eyes. But it was fleeting. He turned and staggered away, leaving me standing in the doorway, clutching the edge of the frame for support. The house fell silent once more. But the tension lingered, heavy and oppressive. My hands shook as I closed the door, locking it behind me. The stillness of the night felt suffocating now, and I was left alone with the echoes of what had just happened, unable to shake the feeling that the quiet would never be the same again. The realization struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated. Like a cold, sharp wind slicing through my defenses. Kevin wasn't talking to me. His words, though directed at me, were never truly meant for me. They belonged to Grace, the woman who owned his heart, the one whose name carried the weight of his unspoken dreams and unresolved longing. Despite knowing he was drunk, despite my efforts to rationalize that this wasn't real, something deep within me stirred. My heart betrayed me, racing wildly in my chest, torn between the suffocating grip of panic and a strange, disorienting cocktail of emotions I couldn't unravel. I should have pushed him away. I knew it with every fiber of my being. This was wrong, on every conceivable level, but my body defied my logic. His words, tinged with a longing so palpable it seemed to hang in the air, made my heart ache in a way that frightened me. I wanted to run, to escape the heat of the moment and the storm of emotions crashing through me. But I was frozen, paralyzed, trapped between fear and an inexplicable need to stay. Confusion, panic, and a flicker of something far more dangerous swirled in my mind like a tempest, pulling me deeper into the moment despite the screaming protests of my better judgment. I could feel reason slipping from my grasp, replaced by the chaotic tide of emotions surging within me. And then, as if the tension finally broke, we collapsed onto my bed. The small, confined space that had once been my sanctuary now felt claustrophobic. The walls closing in as the chaotic energy between us filled every corner. The wind outside howled against the window, and the world beyond faded away. No sound, no movement, only the heavy silence punctuated by the erratic rhythm of my breathing. Kevin's arms stayed wrapped around me, his breath warm against my skin, his presence impossibly close. The weight of his body, the sound of his whispers, words not meant for me, created an ache in my chest that I couldn't explain. I was terrified, not just of him but of myself, of the feelings that rose unbidden, of the way his touch seemed to unravel me. It was as though the lines between who I was and who he saw me as were dissolving, leaving me exposed to a storm of raw, tangled emotions. I couldn't understand the pull I felt toward him, nor could I escape the guilt that came crashing down with it. Kevin had always belonged to Grace, his heart, his devotion, his love. Yet, in this moment, he was here with me, close enough to feel his every breath, to hear the pain hidden in his words. It was as though all the years of distance and understanding had collapsed into nothing, replaced by this fragile, fleeting intimacy that felt like it might shatter at any moment. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching unbearably thin. Each second dragged on, blurring the edges between reality and the surreal dream I desperately wished to wake from. My mind screamed for me to stop, to push him away, to end this madness. But my body betrayed me. His every whisper, every touch, drowned out the rational voice in my head, leaving me suspended in the heat of the moment, unable to act. And just as suddenly as it began, the night seemed to dissolve into a fog. The events that followed were a blur, disjointed fragments of sensation and emotion. I couldn't remember falling asleep. Only the way his presence, his warmth, seemed to envelop me, drawing me into a restless, dreamlike slumber. When I awoke, the first light of morning was seeping through the curtains, painting the room in muted golds and soft shadows. For a fleeting moment, there was peace, until I heard Grace's voice from beyond the door. She was calling his name, her tone filled with something I couldn't quite place. The sound jolted me upright, my heart lurching into my throat. Panic clawed at me as my eyes darted around the room. The disheveled sheets, the discarded clothes on the floor, the faint scent of the night before, all of it painted a picture I wasn't ready to face. Kevin lay beside me, his breathing steady, his expression peaceful in sleep. But the sight of him filled me with a dread so sharp it stole my breath. Memories of the night crashed over me, fragmented and chaotic. I couldn't untangle what had happened, what it meant, or how to face it. All I knew was that I couldn't let Grace find us like this. My hands trembled as I adjusted my clothes, working frantically to erase any trace of what had transpired. Grace's voice called again, louder this time, cutting through the morning stillness. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I turned to Kevin, shaking him gently but urgently. "Kevin," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Wake up." He stirred, his movements slow and uncertain, like someone waking from a vivid dream. His eyes fluttered open, their gaze unfocused, filled with confusion and lingering traces of weariness. He blinked rapidly, struggling to piece together the puzzle of his situation. What's happening? Why am I here?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse and his words barely audible as his eyes darted around the room, taking in its dim, unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, the air between us was heavy with silence, each second stretching into an eternity. We stared at each other, neither of us daring to speak, as though words might shatter the fragile reality we were clinging to. My chest tightened, every breath feeling like a struggle. My mind raced, searching for a solution, an explanation, a way out of this impossible scenario. Then, acting on pure instinct, I whispered urgently, "Grace is outside. She's coming in. Hide under the bed. Now." My voice was sharp, edged with panic, but firm enough to snap Kevin out of his daze. Still visibly confused, Kevin hesitated for a moment, his sluggish mind battling to make sense of my words. But the urgency in my voice seemed to override his questions. He nodded clumsily, his drunken state evident as he awkwardly crawled beneath the bed, his movements noisy enough to make my pulse spike with fear. I smoothed my disheveled hair, adjusted my clothes hastily, and forced myself to take deep, steadying breaths, trying to exude an air of normalcy I didn't feel. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. I opened it hesitantly, the weight of the situation still pressing heavily on my shoulders. Standing there was Grace, her expression a mix of impatience and mild annoyance. Her arms were crossed, and her piercing gaze immediately made my stomach churn. "Why aren't you up yet? It's almost time for school," she demanded, her voice laced with irritation. I swallowed hard, forcing a sheepish smile onto my face. "Sorry," I replied quickly, my voice slightly shaky. "I stayed up late studying. Lost track of time, I guess." Grace scrutinized me, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to analyze every detail of my face. My exhaustion must have been written all over me. But after a tense pause, she sighed and relented. "Fine. Just hurry up and get ready. Breakfast is on the table. Don't be late." "Of course," I said, nodding quickly, grateful for her leniency. As she turned and walked away, I remained frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I feared she might hear it. Once I was sure she was out of earshot, I closed the door quietly and turned back toward the room. "Kevin," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as I crouched down. "She's gone. You need to leave. Now." From under the bed, Kevin emerged hesitantly, his expression a mixture of regret, confusion, and embarrassment. His clothes were rumpled, and his hair was a disheveled mess. He avoided my gaze, his posture awkward, as though the weight of his actions had just hit him. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice soft, tinged with shame. "I don't know what happened last night. I just remember drinking too much." And then, his words trailed off, leaving an uncomfortable silence between us. I cut him off, not wanting to dwell on the details. "It doesn't matter now. The only thing that matters is getting you out of here before Grace starts asking questions. We can't let her find out about this." Kevin nodded reluctantly, his movements slow and careful as he edged toward the door. I watched him with bated breath, every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. Just as he reached the door, he paused, looking back at me one last time, as though he wanted to say something, but the moment passed, and he slipped out quietly. I exhaled sharply, relief and tension mingling in my chest. But the reprieve was short-lived. Moments later, I heard Kevin's voice outside, loud and carefree. "Good morning. It's so early today," he called out. Panic surged through me. Grace stepped out of the kitchen, her gaze landing on him with a mixture of curiosity and mild suspicion. "Were you out last night?" "I didn't hear you come home," she remarked casually, her tone probing. Kevin scratched the back of his head, offering a sheepish grin. "Yeah. I had some things to take care of late last night. Just got back this morning," he explained, his voice unnaturally cheerful. Grace seemed satisfied with his response, her suspicion melting into a laugh. "Well, come eat breakfast then. You must be starving," she said, motioning for him to join her at the table. I emerged from my room soon after, trying to act as though nothing was amiss. But my heart hadn't stopped racing. Each moment felt like walking a tightrope, the fear of discovery looming like a storm cloud overhead. Later, when Grace returned to her room, I seized the opportunity to confront Kevin, pulling him aside. I spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "You need to be more careful. No one can know about this." Kevin looked at me, guilt and unease etched into his features. "I know. I'm sorry for all of this. I'll make it up to you somehow. I promise." His words hung in the air, but they did little to ease the knot of tension in my chest. I nodded curtly, unable to say more. As he left, the enormity of what had happened sank in. This wasn't something I could simply move past. The memory of that night, with all its unanswered questions and unspoken truths, lingered in the corners of my mind, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. Every glance, every silence, Every fleeting interaction between us was colored by the weight of that night, a secret we would carry, whether we wanted to or not. And though the danger seemed to have passed, the echoes of what we had done would remain, haunting us both in ways we couldn't yet understand. The once vibrant connection we shared had withered into stilted, awkward exchanges, where every word felt heavy with unspoken truths. The laughter that used to fill the room like sunshine had vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The warmth that once defined our bond had been eclipsed by shadows we couldn't acknowledge. Grace, with her radiant smile and loving, trusting eyes, remained blissfully unaware. And that only deepened the ache in my chest. Her kindness, her unwavering faith in me, became a cruel reminder of the secret I carried. How could I continue to meet her gaze, knowing that the truth I harbored would shatter the foundation of everything she held dear? The guilt was relentless. It clung to me like a second skin, squeezing the air from my lungs and robbing each day of its light. Every moment spent in her presence felt like walking a tightrope, balancing on a thread of pretense that could snap at any moment. I hated myself for deceiving her, for tarnishing the purity of her love. And yet, I hated my own cowardice even more, my inability to face the consequences of my actions, my refusal to confront the storm I had helped create. Nights were the worst. Alone in the darkness, my thoughts grew louder, more insistent. Regret became a relentless companion, whispering questions that had no answers. Should I have spoken up? Should I have confessed before the weight of this lie grew too heavy to bear? But the idea of dismantling the fragile harmony of our family was paralyzing. The thought of Grace's heartbreaking, of her world crumbling, froze me in place. Kevin, too, bore the weight of our shared secret. The vibrant, carefree version of him that once brought light to the household had retreated into a shell of quiet despair. His laughter, once so infectious, was now a distant memory. We tiptoed around each other like strangers bound by a fragile truce, each afraid that a single misstep would unravel everything. The atmosphere in the house became oppressive, a silent battlefield where every glance and every word carried the threat of exposure. Grace noticed, of course, though she never voiced her concerns. She attributed our strained interactions to the demands of work and life, choosing to see our silence as a symptom of stress rather than the manifestation of a deeper fracture. But I couldn't keep living like this. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of my failure. It felt as if I were drowning, each breath harder to take than the last. I needed an escape, a way to break free from the emotional storm that raged inside me. After weeks of agonizing over my decision, I made up my mind to leave. I told Grace that I needed my own space, a quiet place where I could focus on my studies and regain my footing. Her immediate reaction was one of resistance, her concern written across her face. "You don't have to go," she said softly, her voice tinged with worry. "This is your home. We'll always take care of you here." But I was resolute. I couldn't tell her the real reason. I wasn't fleeing toward independence but away from the crushing weight of my own shame, hiding my true feelings behind a carefully constructed mask. I insisted that this was about my future, about growing up and learning to stand on my own. Grace studied me, her eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she relented. "If this is what you think is best, I'll support you," she said. "But promise me, if anything gets too difficult, you'll let me know." I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Her concern was like a knife in my heart. But I couldn't let her see the cracks in my resolve. John stood silently in the corner. His presence a quiet weight on the room. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret, sorrow, and something else I couldn't place. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed me as I packed my things. The unspoken tension between us was suffocating. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the task at hand, my hands trembling as I zipped my suitcase. When I finally walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me felt like a punctuation mark on a chapter one wasn't ready to end. I left a piece of myself behind that day, a version of me that had once known laughter and light. But as much as it hurt, there was also a flicker of relief. Maybe this was the first step toward redemption. The first step toward finding the peace that had eluded me for so long. As I walked away, the weight of the past didn't disappear. But for the first time, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, the distance I was seeking would help me find a way to heal, to rebuild, and to face the truth that had haunted me for far too long. Living in my small room was a challenge, but it offered me one saving grace: solitude. The quiet wrapped around me like an old, familiar blanket, giving me the space to think, to reflect on everything that had happened. In those still moments, I could almost convince myself that I had left the past behind. But memories have a way of refusing to be silenced. They crept in uninvited, slipping into my thoughts when the world around me was quiet and still. Those memories were relentless. They played on a loop in my mind, a never-ending reel of that fateful night. I dissected every detail, retracing every step, replaying every word. I searched desperately for answers, some resolution to the questions that haunted me. Yet the truth remained elusive, like trying to catch a shadow in the dark. I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. Leaving without explanation, without confession, had seemed like the only option at the time. But now, as I sat with the weight of silence pressing on my chest, I questioned myself. Should I have told Grace the truth? Would she have understood? Or would the pain of knowing have destroyed her? I didn't know the answer. And maybe I never would. Perhaps some questions are not meant to be resolved, but to linger, teaching us lessons in their haunting presence. The decision to stay silent wasn't made lightly. It came from a place of deep care for Grace, a desire to protect her from pain that I feared would be unbearable. Yet, that very choice brought its own torment. Secrets, even those kept with the best intentions, have a way of carving out a hollow space in the soul. Carrying them feels like carrying a burden that grows heavier with time, even as you convince yourself it was the right thing to do. The distance I placed between John and myself was another part of this self-imposed exile. It felt necessary, almost inevitable. After what had happened, preserving space between us was the only way to prevent further complications, to avoid the misunderstandings that could unravel what little stability remained. And yet, in those quiet moments, I missed him, the connection, the understanding we once shared. But sometimes, love demands sacrifice. And for both our sakes, I chose distance. What I've come to realize in this solitude is that growth often arises from the hardest choices. Mistakes, no matter how painful, do not define who we are. It's the lessons we draw from them, the resolve to be better, that truly shape us. The road to self-forgiveness is neither straight nor smooth, it's an uphill climb, marked by setbacks and moments of doubt. Yet, it is a journey worth undertaking because it is the only way to move forward. I have started to rebuild my life on a foundation of lessons learned and a determination to create a better future. Independence has become my cornerstone, along with a quiet strength that comes from understanding myself more deeply. Through all the pain and questioning, I have found clarity in one simple truth: we cannot control the past, but we can shape what comes next. My story carries a deeply reflective lesson: emotions are powerful, and respecting boundaries, both our own and others, is crucial. In moments of weakness, it's easy to make decisions that ripple outward, affecting those around us in ways we can't foresee. But with time and reflection, I've learned that forgiveness, both of others and ourselves, is the key to healing. It doesn't erase the past, but it allows us to live with it and grow stronger. As we reflect on this journey together, it's clear that life's most profound lessons often come from its greatest challenges. The burden of guilt, the struggle for self-acceptance, and the courage to move forward despite the scars, these are what define us. They shape not only who we are but also the lives we touch along the way. After this story, what have you discovered and reflected upon? What lessons have you gathered for your present and future life? Let it guide you towards healthy growth and a balanced path, steering clear of the pitfalls of excessive desire. And now, with these thoughts in mind, we bid you farewell and look forward to meeting again next time. Take care and stay inspired.